Well, there is a new report out urging the world to take action to achieve equality for women. It comes from the Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation. It's called No Ceilings. And while it concludes that, quote, there has never been a better time to be born female, so much work still remains, even here in the United States. I am a very lucky girl. I had a chance to sit down with the one and only Melinda Gates to discuss the report. We talked about the challenges that must still be addressed.
We still have a long way to go to get women empowered economically. I believe that if you empower women economically, societies thrive all over the world. But when you look at things like the pay gap that still exists, or the number of women participating in the workforce, or you look at property rights for women in low-income countries, or financial services, you realize women are still left out in many countries around the world, and we need to do something about that.
Could you figure out a why? When you looked at the data, could you come away with, this is the reason, this is what needs to get done?
Well, I think the idea with the data was to really pull it down so that we could look country by country, because there is no one size fits all in this work, right? But if I had to pull out and say what's one magic bullet of where we should invest, over and over again, it just is glaringly simple: education. And we've done, as a world, we've gotten girls basically to the same level as boys in primary education, but we really haven't invested for girls in secondary education, that is, getting them a quality secondary education and making sure they persist in that education. If you can do that, you open up a lot for a girl.
But here in the United States, 50% of college graduates are women. More than 50% coming out of grad school are women, yet they're basically non-existent when it comes to C-suite jobs. Where's that disconnect?
Well, I think that really relies on private sector to look at those jobs and say, why is it that women only get to certain levels in our country, in our company? What is it that we know about these different levels, and how do we make sure we pull women up? We not just mentor them, but we sponsor them, and we say, hold an interview loop open until we have enough qualified women candidates. Don't just accept an interview pool that has men in it.
Could one of the issues be that when women get to the mid-level of their career, if they're in their mid-30s and they decide to have families, well, once their kids are school age, things get hard. And oftentimes a family decides somebody needs to go home. Is society ready yet for that conversation to be, it could be the husband or it could be the wife, or for the most part, it's the wife?
I think those conversations have to happen on an individual basis in an individual household. I know many households where they've chosen to put the woman first. That takes a lot of courage, though, and you have to have a man who wants to stay home and would be good at that role, and a woman who's willing to give up that role, right? But I think the only way we get there as a society is for individual families to make those decisions and to start have many more of them making decisions, and it becomes an okay thing then to do.
As a culture, do you think we're there yet? I mean, I consider myself a very forward-thinking woman, yet I've been to cocktail parties and find myself with that anxiety when a husband tells me he stays home.
I don't think we're there yet in terms of really empowering women in all types of work throughout the various many sectors in the United States until we have lots of different styles of women and far more women as CEOs and far more women in Congress and all those different ways. No, I don't think we're even close to where we need to be.
Turn the clock back. You studied science and engineering as well as business when you were in school. Did you think that years later there would still be so few women in these fields?
Well, what's most interesting to me is I was a computer science major, right, in the 1980s. Back then, 37% of undergraduates who were majoring in computer science were women. Today, it's down to 18%.
Why?
It's crazy. I think because there are many, many lost points at elementary, middle school, high school for girls. But I think for whatever reason, girls aren't seeing the tech sector being a place they want to work or that's welcoming. And yet you see medical degrees and law degrees, women are graduating. We're graduating more women than men. So we have to make that an okay field to go into. And I think there's work to be done.
Who needs to be doing that work? Is it the government? Is it media? Is it entertainment to start changing what the face of successful women, iconic women, look like?
I think it's everybody. I mean, I think the media, when they turn to an analyst or an expert, they turn less than 25% of the time to a woman. That's a problem. I think in businesses need to say to themselves, why do we have women that are stagnated at certain levels? Why can't we get more women up into these jobs? What is it that we should do? Is there something about our family leave policy? Is it something we're not looking at qualified women candidates? Could we look harder? So I think across all of these places, we need to do more. In the government sector, we really need to grapple finally with paid family leave. It's crazy to me that we're a country that doesn't have that today.
Outside the U.S., is there a country or a region that needs help the most, that you believe, whether it's foreign aid or philanthropic dollars, really needs to focus on women and girls? Because they seem to be safer today than ever.
Yes, I think low-income countries across the board still have a whole host of issues to work on, whether it's property rights or a woman having access to a loan, whether she has access to the right seeds for her farm. Predominantly, these women are farmers in Africa, but if she doesn't have access to the latest drought-resistant seeds, as climate change happens, she's going to be disproportionately affected. So those low-income countries have a lot of work to do. And I have to say, though, it's really interesting as I travel around the world, which I get to do a lot for the foundation. It was as I would be traveling back and thinking about what those women need and what their countries ought to do that I started to ask myself the question about the United States. Are we far enough yet? And I kept coming back to the answer of no, we're not as a world yet.
Can we ask small businesses to have extended maternity leave policies? If I ran a business that only had 8 employees and I had to take those employees when they want to go on maternity leave and pay them for a year or 2 years, it might put me out of business.
I don't think we can have mandated policies in those cases for small businesses, but I think we need to lead in some of these areas, and we're not even leading in the government sector yet, and that has to be done. I mean, if you don't have a policy for paid family leave in this day and age in the government sector, you're not, that no other OECD country is where we are on that issue.
Was there a victory that you saw in the data?
Oh, there's absolutely a victory around maternal mortality. That is, women who die during childbirth. We've basically cut that number in about half in the last 20 years. It's really incredible. And we have the opportunities. We know what to do now going forward between now and 2030. And we have the opportunity now to cut that again by 2/3. That's incredible progress.
The biggest failure you saw in the data?
The biggest failure I saw was that we're still not serving women well enough. I mean, to not count their unpaid labor, that when they take care of a young child or they take care of an aging parent, we don't even look at that. To me, that really shouldn't be. That says something about society, that we don't value that work, and yet we know those are some of the most important times in life, when you're young and when you're elderly, right? So that needs to be valued much more than it is.
More of my interview with Melinda Gates. She worked closely with Hillary and Chelsea Clinton in putting together the No Ceilings report about the need for equal rights for women around the world. I asked her what it was like working with the former Secretary of State and whether she would support her in a potential bid for president.
She's been a big champion for women and girls, and for me that's inspirational. She was all in this No Ceilings project, just as I would expect her to be. Whether she was going to run or not going to run, she's always been for women and girls, and I think that's great.
If she does run, will you support her?
So Bill and I never endorse political candidates on either side of the aisle. That's because whoever comes into office, we're going to hopefully be around still 30 and 40 years from now. I hope we're still alive and working really hard. But we're going to work with whoever's in office, so we never endorse a candidate.
Whether it's Hillary or not, if we saw a woman become president of the United States, do you think these numbers would change drastically as far as the advancement of women?
If we have a woman for president, it has to be a qualified woman for president. So if we have a qualified woman for president, and I would put the "and" there, you get more women in Congress, then I think we would see a lot of policy changes for women in the U.S. I don't know that a presidential candidate can do it necessarily on their own. So I think you need the commitment of all branches of our government if we're going to make huge policy changes and changes for women.
Seeing all the noise around this subculture in America who's anti-vaccinating their children, given the work that you've done, the philanthropic dollars you have put towards vaccinating the world, specifically in Africa, what do you think of this?
I think it's crazy. I meet women all over the world who value vaccines, and they will tell you that they walked 3 hours in the heat or 10 kilometers. They'll often have a baby on their back and another one that's walking alongside to get that vaccination for their child, because they know the difference those diseases make in their community. They know it's a life and death emergency. So to me, it's crazy that in the United States we've forgotten what those diseases are like, and we would allow them to come back because parents don't want to vaccinate their kids. No way.
Do you believe that private philanthropic dollars are the best way to really make a difference in this world? Because it doesn't seem like aid or governments are really doing nearly as much as you are at this point.
Well, I think you have to look at what philanthropic dollars can do. And they really are tiny, actually, compared to government funding. But what they can do is be a catalytic wedge. They can show ways or take pilots or experiments and points of light and prove out whether they work. So a private philanthropy can take a risk where a government can't or won't. And once you prove that risk out, then it's our job as philanthropy to get governments to scale up those pieces. And so that's how we see our philanthropic dollars being used to the greatest of good.
Is there an example that you could point to that you feel has been the greatest success?
Vaccines. We were one of the early founders of a thing called an Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. And what we've been able to do is garner private and public dollars together to create a large vaccine fund that pulls vaccines through. So we can then go to pharmaceutical companies and say, now there's a market for your vaccines in Africa where there wasn't before, and there's a fund. So if you will now invest in some of these diseases like malaria that we don't have in the United States, you can still make a profit. And I think because of that vaccine fund, we now think there are something like 4 to 5 million children alive if it wasn't for that vaccine fund that started in 1999. That's probably the thing I'm most proud of.
Those 4 to 5 million children who are alive, is there enough clean water for them to drink, schools for them to go to, jobs for them to have one day?
Not yet, but there will be. And so the way Bill and I look at this is health is a precursor to everything else. If you don't start with a healthy life, you can't then go on to have a great education and participate in society. So you have to really take care of those early childhood illnesses so a child can grow up and have their full potential. And that's why we invest so much in health in the developing world.